Geopolitics is the formation of grand strategy within a geographical template. The Great Game. In the early 19th century, Napoleon almost established a dominion over Europe. But Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815. At the Congress of Vienna, the victorious nations, Russia, Britain, Austria, and Prussia, divided Europe to create between them a power equilibrium, preventing any single nation from being able to repeat Napoleon's feat of continental European domination. Of these nations, Britain and Russia were the two main victors over Napoleon, defeating him on land and at sea. These were not just great powers in Europe, but global empires. Britain had already, in the 18th century, established her dominion in India, the jewel in her crown. The Royal Navy ensured communications between England and India. The other great empire, Russia, was an enormous landmass that extended across Eurasia and whose southern expansion could bring her to the gates of India. British fears over this notion prompted the Great Game, the geopolitical rivalry for Eurasian preeminence which lasted the rest of the 19th century. After annexing Transcaucasia, now Georgia, in 1812, Russia established a southern base of operations beyond the Transcaucasian mountains that extended her military influence in Persia, now Iran, her southern neighbour. Britain was concerned that Russia's expanding sphere of influence would allow her to invade India. These fears pushed Britain to expand her frontiers in India north, resulting in the unsuccessful Afghan campaign of 1839. Back in Europe, Russian armies helped Prussia and Austria suppress uprisings in their own territories in 1848, the year of revolutions, expanding her influence further. More importantly, Russia was making the Ottoman Empire increasingly more reliant on her to upkeep its possessions, establishing an effective protectorate over it. The British government worriedly began to observe these developments, in particular Russia's possible control of Constantinople, which would allow Russia's Black Sea fleet into the Mediterranean from Crimea. Ultimately, this resulted in the Crimean War of 1853-6. Although Britain, with the help of France and the Ottomans, won the Crimean War, reaffirming Britain as the leading sea power, it did not stop Russia from expanding on land in Central Asia. By the turn of the 20th century, only Afghanistan stood between them. The Anglo-Russian rivalry in Asia influenced the British geographer Halford Mackinder, an avowed imperialist and social Darwinist, to conceptualize a grand theory of geopolitics in his 1904 paper, The Geographical Pivot of History. Out of considerations for British imperial statecraft, planning for the future, Mackinder devised the Heartland thesis. The Heartland is the inner Eurasian landmass surrounded by mountainous frontiers everywhere apart from in Eastern Europe. His dictum was, who controls Eastern Europe controls the Heartland. Who controls the Heartland controls the world island, controls the world. He feared that an industrializing Russian Empire, as the 20th century continued, which occupied the Heartland, would, through the development of rail lines out of European Russia, be able rapidly to transport armies from Europe east and south to invade India and expand in the Far East. To prevent Russia from reaching the Indian Ocean, he proposed containment by the British Empire. But World War intervened, and history brought Russia and Britain together to fight the world wars against Germany and Japan. Then Russia in 1917 was plunged into revolution. During this period, the Heartland imploded and reformed as the Soviet Union. After the World Wars that took place between 1914 and 1945, a bipolar world emerged between the liberal democracies and the communist Soviet Union. The Heartland thesis was adapted by the US for its containment strategy of the Soviet Union. Nicholas Speakman, a Dutchman working for the Americans, revised Mackinder's theory to emphasize that the Eurasian rimland was a more important region than the heartland for American interests. Historically, it was in the rimland where Eurasian civilizations were spawned along the Silk Route. In many ways, during the Cold War, the United States became the geopolitical heir to the British Empire and its navy, as it now took the mantle of the sea power containing the heartland along the rim. Studies of British imperial grand strategy influenced a range of US theorists, most notably George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Until this day, the US sees Eurasia as a chessboard, and its game is against Russia and China. The rimland continues to hold the world's main geopolitical hotspots: Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Kashmir, North Korea, and the South China Sea, as a legacy of the containment strategy. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we entered a unipolar world with the US as sole superpower and Russian influence waning. Kissinger's PhD, A World Restored, examined how Britain balanced European powers after the defeat of Napoleon, and so Kissinger sought to balance Eurasia during Soviet containment post-World War II by aligning China against its ideological ally, the USSR. Although China had been a major player in the Great Game for thousands of years, the British Empire successfully put it to sleep with the Opium Wars and subjected it to a century of what it saw as humiliation with the British colony at Hong Kong between 1897 and 1997. In 1971, Kissinger took Nixon to meet Chairman Mao and open up China to US trade in an attempt to circumscribe the USSR with an expanded American sphere of influence. With the US distracted in the Middle East after 2001, the Great Game realigned to become a rivalry between the US and a reinvigorated China, expanding its own sphere of influence west along the Rimland and the Old Silk Road to Europe and Africa with its One Belt, One Road policy. The Trump administration has realigned the US as a Pacific power in a trade war with China. Again, Trump is now seeking to separate China from its potential allies in Russia and North Korea. The Great Game continues.